What's up, Shred Sexies? Welcome back. Down to the fingers. Some people were like, what happened to the Sunday video, buddy? Truth is, I actually got mixing and I really enjoyed it. And so we're dropping down to 2 videos just during the week, Tuesdays and probably Thursdays, maybe Fridays. Depends on when I have to do stuff. There's a pretty crazy couple months coming up. 2025 has just been an absolutely mental year for me, but whatever, I guess. I was had a good run there, if you will, where I didn't have to do anything, and now all of a sudden it's all been crammed into 1 year. So whatever, get her done. So there's that. Someone was actually asking about the super void stuff, and this led to the whole sort of the lesson, if you will, today, which is about practice mentality, which is a lot more than what you think it is. We're going to go over some aspects of it, of course, but they're like, I keep making the mixes better. I keep buying a couple select pieces of software. We're going to have a whole list at the end of the year, probably sometime in November. So, or maybe October. People can sort of wait for the deals. I would recommend signing up for their newsletter and stuff like that, and they'll have deals that come on there all the time. Just snag them while they're getting the deal. I think I got 3 SSL ones recently: guitar strip, vocal strip, and drum strip for $40 American. Now they usually go for around $100, so I didn't really look at the price because I don't care. But usually that's what they go for, and honestly, it's a really killer piece of software. So if you're on the fence about picking up some software, I would highly recommend the SSL native stuff. The one downside's iLock, but it's minimally intrusive, I guess you could say. So the those things have made a big fundamental difference. There was another one too called Master the Mix, which had 2 pieces of software, Rezo, and another one called something. I can't remember what it is. But it's one sidechain compression. That's the one I haven't used yet. That's going to be in the mastering stage when I do sidechain compression with 2 different types of saturation, because I want to saturate the mid-side stuff and compress it, and then saturate just the center, and then use an EQ to basically control it. But since I'm doubling up on the saturation, I have to use sidechain compression to control the main one, so it doesn't start flying off into no man's land, if you will. So it's going to be a cool strategy to fatten up the mix and whatnot. But that's what's going on with Super Void. And really, the thing is people are like, you see this meme all the time with respect to mix engineers are like final mix, and then final mix, and then final mix in the car volume 1. And it just keeps going down. You have 17. That's true. I must have told myself at least 10 times, at least, that I'm done. I'm like, this is the final mix. And I was like, no, it's not. The ones I worked on this morning and on the weekend, these are the final mixes, because I finally got all the pieces together. And a big part of it is just experience. When you get to the higher end stuff, and it's not just about making a decision at some point in time to be like, the next piece of whatever art I put out, in this case, audio recording. For me personally, though, I'm like, the next one I put out has to be such a significant jump forward that people are like, I can't even believe this is the same mix. Now, there's been a whole bunch of delays and other garbage with the finger, which is almost done, by the way. I think we'll be back to playing guitar by the end of the month, so it's awesome. But there's that. You know what I mean? Like, I had some other real world stuff to deal with. It's kept on interrupting, but the fact of the matter is that I wasn't very good at mixing. I knew some strategies. I kind of had some ideas, but I hadn't really sort of sat down with it and messed with it enough to make it work. You know what I mean? Like tinkering. So you come up with your own little convoluted process to be like, this is how I like to work. And I've seen this everywhere with mix engineers. So like, well, this is my template and this is my workflow, whatever. And I'm like, everybody's is different. So, that's just normal. But that's my point, is just like when you're in the rookie stage and it takes a long time. That's just it. You make pretty good gains for like the first 40% of the necessary amount of work to go from I don't know anything, I suck, to being like, that's a pretty damn good mix. I would buy this with hard-earned cash because the music is good in most cases. Let's hope that's true. But then the mix is also awesome, right? Where you're not like, well, yikes, okay, it's the music is good, but it sounds terrible. You know what I mean? And it's noticeable, it's obvious, it's amateurish or whatever it is. So at some point in time, you're like, well, I don't want to do that again. You can make marginal improvements. It's like the Apple methodology where they're like, yeah, no, look, we got a bigger camera and it's like 1/8 slimmer. You know what I mean? Like stupid stuff nobody cares about. That's why their iPhone is tanking. Oh, well, boys, it is what it is. Those goggles, how's that working out for you? Wow, the sheer lunacy of that. Anyways, there's these marginal improvements, but people aren't like blown away. That's what I mean. You have to kind of reinvent yourself. You see Aerosmith doing that right now with this new kid, Youngblood or Young Gun or whatever his name is. I don't know. But I was like, oh, there it is. That's why we had him at the VH1 or whatever that was. And the Much Music stuff, or sorry, MTV or whatever it is, down there in the States. That's why he was all of a sudden showing up with Aerosmith and they were doing like a little cover with some Aussie tribute. Again, stepping stone now to be like, oh, listen, this is Aerosmith's new single from their new album with this new dude. Okay. Yay. And there was the other one too, the Twisted Sister stuff. That was crazy, right? After D went after Kiss so brutally and then all of a sudden said, we'd never do that. 5 years later, you know what I mean? It's just like, oh, bro, seriously? And honestly, it feels like a desperate cash grab to me. It's like Motley Crue playing Las Vegas. No disrespect to the bands or anything like that. It's just like, come on, guys. You know it's over. He didn't even try to fucking basically make it awesome, you know what I mean? Or keep it that way. You know it's true. You got out of shape and lazy and famous and whatever else it is, and life got cushy. You lost the eye of the tiger, and therefore the show suffered. And I've seen the live footage, and it's not good, man. It's just like, wow. Nope. No. Hell no. And I guess the lead singer from At the Gates, he kicked it too, hey? He just kicked it like today. That's nuts. Slaughter of the Souls was one of those albums that I remember listening to being like, this is a game changer. Carcass Heartwork was one. Clandestine by Entombed was another one. This is obviously post all the major level benchmarks that were created in the 80s. But this I felt like was the next evolution of bands and stuff like that. And obviously At the Gates, Slaughter of the Soul was one of those absolutely phenomenal albums which just changed your perspective. And honestly, it started a whole new chart. Now listen, honestly, it's their approach to the aggressiveness of it. They took the whole In Flames formula. Their Jester race is quite good if you like that kind of music and stuff. People are like Horacle. I'm like, yeah, it's okay, but they're starting to lose me there. I prefer the first album where it seems a little bit more amateur, sure, but it's more genuine. You know what I mean? Like I'm feeling the energy there a lot more. So for me, that's that one. But then, of course, At the Gates took that formula and made it more aggressive and just knocked it out of the park. Just like, wow. Okay, so that's what you can do with it when you put it in the hands of the masters. So it was really, really, truly spectacular. I know I'm taking a bit of a side tour here, but you know what I mean? Again, the thing is my earlier criticism of like things like Motley Crue and Aerosmith, like, I'm sorry, boys, why? I don't think you have anything more to say. I don't even know if you had much to say sort of like post 2000. You know what I mean? I'll admit some of the stuff in the 1990s is pretty decent, right? And there's some pretty rockin' tunes off the sort of revival years, when Pump came out and Permanent Vacation and whatnot. So it's definitely, sorry, comparable to the stuff they were doing in the 70s, but like in 2025 now, man, I'm just like, it just seems like they're trying to pump up this new kid by trotting out the dinosaurs. Like he's used that before, and Huntinator is like, yeah, definitely, it's true. We just kind of roll out the corpses and be like, oh yeah, no. Plus this other guy here, yeah, Young Gun. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think it works that way, man. Like Wolfgang Van Halen gets way more street cred from me for just, doing his own thing. I feel like he sold out a little bit with the whole radio rock thing, but at the same time, I understand. You know, the thing is who knows? If he would have been unleashed like his old man, because you can't be sort of like whatever, marinated in that stew and not pick up a few things for sure. Especially if you're touring with the man, you know what I mean? Playing bass. It's just like a first world class lesson every single night at how to play guitar. But, and work a crowd and do this live show and everything else, right? But you get my point, is essentially he had to make concessions because the industry had changed so brutally. But yeah, lots of weird music news going on there. I just thought that was kind of interesting, but still getting back to the original thing of essentially the practice mentality is I spent a couple years mixing the music because I wanted to get to that next level. And that's really what it takes. That extra 60% necessary to get, once you get past the easy stuff, the first 40%, the 60% is a slog. It's nose to the grindstone stuff. It's like you have to learn stuff on your own. People will be like, compression's important. And you're like, yeah, right? And then you just like don't do anything with that information because you're like, okay, compression's important, instead of actually learning about compression or going to watch a video about how to use this piece of software that you have, or reading the instruction manual and maybe gleaning some really important information where you can set up your plugin to sort of take advantage of, like, well, if you set it like this, you're going to get it at max bias or whatever it is. And that might be important. I've seen lots of times when mix guys are like, basically, it's really important to read the manuals on these plugins because you'll learn a lot about it. And it's true, right? And that matters because, there's order of operations when you're talking about recording and mixing and whatnot. You're talking about the different types of plugins that work well together, that play well together, that essentially enhance the music. There's ways of mixing it in. There's what you're listening for, not just in terms of subtractive EQ and the sweetening EQ, but also like having the instruments sit in the mix. What does that even mean? You know what I mean? That's something I saw CLA and a couple other greats from the 90s basically hammer home many times. They're like, oh, these instruments got to sit in the mix more, you know what I mean? And I didn't really know what that meant until the weekend. And then I started listening to it as I was making adjustments to certain parallel tracks. And I'm like, when I do that, it kind of fits in the mix better. Like before it was more narrow, and now when I kind of spread it out, it just sounds better, fuller. I was like, oh, it sits in the mix. You know what I mean? And that's my point. I always thought about that, like, how do you make an instrument sit in the mix? But it took 5 years for me to actually put the words to an actual thing that I could relate it to in the real world, in this case, in a mix. It's like music. People will be like, play a 1-4-5 chord progression. You're like, okay, in the key of G, that's G major, that's C major, that's D major, right? So you start doing the E and the A type chords together, and then you do the A and the D type chord together, and then you play some C's in the D, you know what I mean? So there's a whole bunch of different variations to being able to string these things together, but of course, most people are like, okay, well, that's just with respect to a major chord progression. You're like, to take the 1 chord, the 4 chord, and the 5 chord. But you're like, what if I took that concept and applied it now to a minor scale? So you got the 1-4-5. Well, the first thing would be the music math. right? So you're like in the key of G major. If I'm moving the 1 chord to the 6th position, that's E, the natural minor, right? Then you jump up. Well, that's going to be the note A. It's directly above it at the 12th fret, right? A whole 12th fret. And the A string is A, right? And that's the Dorian position, 2nd degree. Then up a whole step for the 5. That's the 3rd degree. So it's 6, 2, 3. Those are all the minor chords. You see what I'm getting at here? And then you can be like, and expand out on that. I can be like, starting on the 6 here doesn't give me a lot of sort of, interest factor. Why not move to the 2 chord in the minor? In this case, it'd be the 7, right? So now you get diminished moving to the 2 chord, which could be the Dorian flavor. You see what I'm getting at here? Instead of you being like, oh, there's a 1, 4, 5 and just a major key, now you can start to relate that information. If you know it's the 2 of the scale that you're working in for a scale degree, then you know that's the Dorian position. And the Dorian position has a whole bunch of chords or arpeggios that can basically be layered over top of it. Diminished or major or minor. You know what I mean? You can do inversions. There's so many different things. And you're like, major? Really? I'm like, yeah, of course. You might have to make a small alteration. Probably dominant 7 is going to work better. But essentially, yes, there are no real rules, and that's just it. By substituting in some of these more sort of like diametrically opposite chords that you wouldn't think would happen there is how the magic happens. You're like, that's a great chord progression. It sounds really interesting and fresh. Boom. You got yourself a hit, if you will. Did you see what I mean? It started from this original position. That's the practice mentality right there. Instead of just being like, oh, do a 1, 4, 5 using the cage system, using, the key of G major, doing all the major stuff, that's great. And once you get done that, which takes you about what, 2, 3 months, then what? You're still going to practice it, of course, but now you're like, what if I took that idea from the practice mentality, me like recycle it one more time. Now I apply it to the relative minor, in this case, E minor. Boom, all of a sudden this new sort of layer reveals itself. Then you're like, okay, well, obviously a 2-5-1 works in a minor key and a 2-5-1 works in a major key. And you're like, I was going to start off on diminished anyways. So now it's the 2. And then essentially, again, you're talking about the 4 and 5, right? But you could also see it as 2, 5, and 1, right? So there's a lot of synergy and obviously overlap on top of that. And that's where the theoretical stuff starts to actually cross the barrier into practical world application. Because you're like, this basic concept, this sequence of chords, moving from the 1 chord to the 4 chord to the 5 chord and then back to the 1 chord, creates like this fundamental musical block. And so if you know how to manipulate that, then you're like, okay, well, if it works in a major key, and then I can extrapolate out and it works in the modes, and it makes most sense doing obviously the major and the relative minor, 1 and 6. But then again, I also have the melodic minor. So I'm sure the 1, 4, 5 would apply when I'm talking about the melodic minor. What's the 1 chord? It's going to be like a minor major 7 or major minor 7 or whatever they call it, and then the next one and the next one, whatever is going to be relative to that. So another way to apply the 1, 4, 5. Then you're like, there's the harmonic minor. What does that mean? Oh, there is no 5. It's a sharp 5. So, okay, I got to play this augmented now off the sharp 5. You know what I mean? Again, you're like, by doing that, you're like, well, the harmonic minor is directly relatable to the major modes. Those two scale systems basically perfectly superimpose over top of each other. They're not always usable, but they work out perfectly. Okay, there's no variation between them. So the sharp 5 can be like this new flavor that you get to exercise as an arpeggio, as some sort of chord type. And then, of course, there's all the exceptions, secondary dominance, backdoor dominance. There's a million of these things that you can then start manipulating just the 1, 4, 5. Instead of playing the 4 chord, you can I'm going to substitute in a secondary dominant. Instead of the 5 chord, you're going to be like, I'm going to do an altered dominant now. right? Instead of just doing your dominant 7 chord or something like that, you're going to play an altered dominant to add more sort of color to resolve down to a more complex 1 chord, either the major or the minor. Again, this is practice mentality. This 145 has now grown from this tiny little sort of compartmentalized piece of information to this massive body of information that you can then start to feed into the machine with respect to the practice regime. So now you're like, okay, if I'm starting off with these groups of chords now based on the D, G, and B string, right, from the cage system, I want to start off with the 1 chord from the relative minor, boom, right, in the key of C major, that would be A minor. You're like, then I want to go to the 4 chord, and that's going to be D, which is also going to be minor, right? Or D minor 7. And then you'd be like, I got to jump up one more time to E minor 7 before going back. And of course, I go up a whole step from there and play B diminished. And I also have, obviously, the relative major, C major, which is going to be a nice one. So you could use either of those chords as a transition to essentially get back to the start again, or start on one of those chords. Now, obviously, starting on the 1 chord, but ending on the 6 chord, not a bad idea, but a little ambiguous, if you will. So that's the thing. You have to develop the practice mindset to be like, these are like little closed musical loops. Like an equation in math, one side has to equal the other. Like in a music situation, it creates a little loop, musically speaking, where you have like this sequence of chords that, although they can be eclectic, creates like a sort of a discernible actual, circuit of sounds. And there it is. You know what I mean? You're now thinking about stuff musically, which allows you to practice this stuff in a practice context. Way too many people think that the practice mentality means, oh, I'm going to practice a bunch of technical elements, play scales, use alternate picking, economy picking, sweep picking and stuff, do 3 notes per string, the classical method, whatever it is, diagonals, pentatonics. The the more exotic scales with melodic minor and harmonic minor, or the Hungarian gypsy, whatever floats your boat. But the key takeaway here is that no matter what, is that's not really practicing music. That's just sort of developing the technical requirements to be able to play higher orders of music. But the first step has to be combine these elements together. If you moving to a 6 chord, well, you have all of those options now. There's the 1-4-5. You have the 2-5-1 combination. So you can use those chords to basically, and you have the sharp 5, which is a half step down before you get up to the 6, right? You have all of those options. So if the 6 is the target chord, the practice mentality is like, I should set it up with 1 or 2 chords. Do. You know what I mean? That kind of an idea is going to be invaluable for practicing, because then in a real world situation, you actually hear what that means. If the bass player just all of a sudden goes to the 6th note, right, and he's doing it, and you're like, I want to play 2 chords that are complementary to that 6th chord. What chords are those? Boom, that's where you start with, right there. And the fact is that most people don't actually see that. You'd be like, well, I could move up to the diminished. That's going to be one of them. It's going to sound pretty nice. It's going to give me like a like a E minor 7 when I do the F sharp diminished triad over top of that bass note, right? So now I've got 4 in a row. Keep going up kind of situation to the next one where I jump up to A, because it's going to be E, F sharp, and A, right? or I should say E, F, and A, because you got to flatten the third. But you get the point. Is every time I start tacking on one of these extra triads and stuff like that, I get an extension of the actual chord. And so you can start to use that when they're playing a bass note. You can move to this other triad and be like, oh, okay, when I go to the third one, you know, the one based off the third diminished, it sounds okay. But when I go to the one, in this case, when I'm doing the 6th degree based on the 5th, you're like, that sounds really awesome. So then the practice mentality dictates, you're like, well, where are all the 5s using the cage system? And then there's just a G major vamp or an E minor vamp, if you will, going on. And you just start playing a bunch of A minor triads all over the place. And you're like, there it is. You knew what chord to play. You knew how it relates to the cage system. You know how to make an alteration to the A major chord to turn it into A minor. You know where all the roots are. And then you just proceed to do that all over the place. And then you're like, okay, well, now I can start factoring that in. I can do this E minor, and then I can move to A minor. And you start doing combinations where you're moving around on the fretboard doing that. That's practice mentality, okay? Not just sort of practicing the technical requirements, actually thinking about how you can arrange these things, and then seeking out a backing track, most likely a vamp, or creating your own. And then from there, essentially laying out the real world practice exercise. Don't sit there and try to tab it out or any of this other crap. Pick up your guitar and basically be like E minor, A minor. So you start off by just picking a set of strings and play a bunch of E minors, then move to the A minors and be like, it's the same sequence, but starting with the root note on A, right? And start to then put them together. E, A, E, A, E, A, it's kind of thing like that, or vice versa. Then maybe jump over top like E, E, A, E, E, A, and you keep doing a leapfrog kind of deal. And there it is. That's actual practice, right? Because in your mind, you're like, I got to take this A major chord, convert it to A minor, and I've got the E major chord, but I already know it's going to be E minor relative to the G major stuff. That one's pretty straightforward, starting in the E type position, starting in the C type position, starting in the A type position, whatever. And Bob's your uncle. I think far too many people just skip over top of that step there and then question why they're not getting better on the instrument. There's a huge portion of the actual learning of the instrument that's cerebral. We don't really talk about it because most people just want to watch videos where the guitars in their hands are like, show me some scale or something else like that, without realizing that there's this whole new dimension that needs to be considered. Initially, you can be like, yeah, no, just show me the scale shapes and everything, and you're working away on that. But once you hit a certain point, you have to start thinking like a musician, and that means basically taking into account that you have to organize sort of different flavors. You're like, in this instance, I need a bit more salt. You're going to basically play more variations of just E minor, I should say, E minor 9, E minor 11, E minor 13, whatever, and be able to play that. In this configuration, there's E minor. In this configuration, it's E minor 9 like this. If you can even do it, E minor 13 or something. What is the 13 in relation to E minor? If you don't know, figure it out. If you have to, go on the internet and ask AI or something like that, or look for some sort of help on how to do extensions on a minor triad. And doing things like that is all part of the practice mentality. You accept that there's a portion of the stuff that you're going to have to do with respect to music that forces you to then go out and seek out knowledge, and then sit down and painstakingly apply it over and over and over again, like I had to mix this music 100 times, until you finally hit that plateau. And you will hit it if you actually put your head down, and you have to just be like, listen, it's going to take a while. You don't rush it. You just keep your nose to the grindstone, and you just basically push all the faders at once. Boom. And be cognizant. Be like, if I'm starting to slack on some of the technical aspects, then take a few take a week or whatever it is and just work more on that. And then once you kind of get it back up, be like, okay, start to factor in the other one and stuff like that. Play to several pieces of music that you're very familiar with. So you know exactly, it just takes another sort of dimension of complexity out of the actual practice session because you already know what the chord progression is going to be or where you can move to. And then, of course, just keep changing up your practice sessions. Be like, okay, I'm constantly playing in the minor pentatonic. If I'm doing that, what are the other two positions relative to the diatonic scale? Can I also play them at? Practice mentality. Take this one piece of information, relate it somewhere else. If I can play 3 notes per string starting on the first degree, and that's a major triad, well, a major triad happens at 4 and 5. That must mean I can move this scale shape started at 4 and start at 5 and get different modes. Another one, right? Same thing with 6 moving to 3 and 2. Yeah, same idea there, right? Again, 1, 4, 5, the synergy. Right, look at the 2 and the 3 and then the 6 over here, and then it's 1 and 4 and 5, right? So you see like there's this weird sort of like inversion going on. And listen, you may or may not understand what that means, but more importantly is you start to see and recognize there's this yin and yang relationship, and when you do, you look for it. And when you look for it, obviously all the pieces fall into place because you start to engage the critical mindset, which is going to set you free. Knowing a bunch of useless facts is just that, useless. You have to be able to take that information, process it, and then put it to the fretboard. And then later on, when you get good enough, you can sit down and just think about stuff. And I'll leave it at this. I just watched a video with Rick Graham, and he was talking about working with the intervals that are right next to each other. So, you know, C and D, and then D and E, and then E and F, you know, this kind of situation. And how to achieve that in whatever respect that he was looking to do. I didn't really care, but he's like, sometimes when I'm doing these more sort of abstract exercises to train my mind to hear and recognize these interval sounds, which is incredibly important, especially the dissonant ones, that's where all the magic happens. Johann Sebastian Bach 101. But he's like, I like to sit there and think about it deeply for like a week or maybe 2. And same with me. And I've heard that from a lot of really, really high-end guitar players. Sometimes it's not about just diving right in. You just sit there and kind of mull it over for a while. And then once you get it sort of fairly concrete, then you get your motivation up and you basically sit there and you try to hash it out on the guitar. And that's another big part of it. And the last one is the willpower and motivation and dedication to the instrument to be like, get off my ass and actually fucking do it. Instead of being like, show me, be like, I'm going to figure this out for myself. See you in the next one.